Have you ever found it difficult to believe that Jesus isn't a myth or that the Bible might be true? As an atheist, I used to believe all these things, but now it's time to learn the truth. I'm going to share a few things that happened recently, things I couldn't make up and certainly couldn't do unless something supernatural was happening. So first of all, let me introduce myself. My name's Paul. I'm a former atheist, now an evangelist, a lover of Jesus, a lover of people. I'm out on the streets preaching the gospel. I pray for the sick and I see God do mighty miracles. And I work with a group of people who minister to those that are homeless and those that are in need. And if you would like to support the ministry, then please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button and hit the bell to be notified of future videos. So I'm often out on the streets every week preaching the gospel, praying for people. And as I share the gospel and talk with people, then I find that there are people that do not want to believe. They don't want to believe that Jesus is real. And what is that based on? I used to be an atheist and I used to have exactly that opinion. But what is that truly based on? And then there are people that do believe in Jesus, that do believe Jesus is real. And again, what is that based on? So recently I was out on the streets and I came across two ladies and got into a conversation with them and asked one of them if they were a Christian. And she said to me, "No, I'm not a Christian." And then she thought for a moment and said, "But if I was to pick a religion, I'd pick Buddhism." So I said to her, "Okay, so where's Buddha buried?" And she said to me, "Well, I know that Buddha was cremated and put into some jars and was sent out into various temples and you can go and see them." I went, "Yep, that's right." I said, "So secondly then, where's Muhammad buried?" And she went, "Oh, I don't know where Muhammad buried." I said, "Well, I'll tell you where Muhammad's buried. He's buried in Saudi Arabia and people go and make pilgrimages to see him." And then I said to her, "Where's Jesus buried?" And she said, "I don't know where Jesus is buried." And I said, "Well, that's the point. He isn't buried. He's alive." And as I was just talking to her, she started to think about it. All of a sudden, the Holy Spirit said to me something about the other individual. So I started to then explain to the other individual sensitively the difficulties with the relationship that she'd been seeing, even to the point of the exact words that had been spoken to her and how she was made to feel unloved and not worthy of being loved. And as I spoke this, she welled up with tears and she started to get into a bit of a mess. And I just shared with her that Jesus loved her and Jesus said that she is worthy of being loved. And because of the circumstances then, I couldn't do any more other than to encourage them both to go and seek Jesus. There was circumstances which stopped me from leading them to the Lord at that point in time. But I'm sure we're going to beat them again because they're local. And then, not long after that, I bumped into a Christian, started talking to them, and I was really surprised that as I spoke to them, they started to manifest a demon. They started to get angry and start to raise their voice. And ultimately, they had to leave and walk off. And actually, it's not the first time that Christians have manifest demons in front of me. At some of our meetings, we've had people that have walked in that are great Christians, lovers of Jesus, but when they come in, they start foaming at the mouth and they start manifesting. And we've delivered them and cast the demons out. And then another conversation with an individual that I'd never met before. When I was telling them about Jesus and what he did, they actually said to me that they thought Jesus was a myth, that it was a story and it wasn't true, and he wasn't really a person that had existed in history. So I shared the gospel with him, the evidence of Jesus, and ultimately, outside the store, they gave their life to Jesus. Now, this is all from a former atheist who used to think this was all a load of rubbish. So let me be clear. As a former atheist, I've found that Jesus is not a myth and that the Bible is true. It's not a mythical book. So it's time to learn what is the truth and to get moving. Time waits for nobody, but Jesus is waiting for you. Heaven has room for you to go and enter into, but hell does too. Either way, you make your choice and God will honour that choice. But in making your choice, make sure you've got the facts and you've got the truth on which to base that choice. Don't just base it on what you want to believe, but base it on evidence. So as a former atheist, let's just first take a look at the Bible. Isn't it just another book of stories? I used to think so, but wow, I found that I was so wrong. The Bible just isn't a book. The Bible is 66 books written by 40 different people over 1,500 years. There's never been a book like it in history ever. During that 1500 years, over that period of time, at the beginning, there were things written that came true. Things that were prophesied, things that were forecast that later on in hundreds of years actually came true. And guess what? It wrote about things of today, things that are still coming true today. No other book has done that. So it's prophetic and it forecasts what's happening in the future. It may have got 40 different people writing it, but it has one author. It has to have one author to orchestrate all those things from start to finish. It's not a book that was written looking backwards. There's never been a book like it. Also, it's helped archaeologists find things that they've been unable to find. It's helped them unearth archaeological evidence that in the Bible was true. For hundreds of years, archaeology has used the Old Testament and the New Testament to find people, to find buildings, places, civilizations, to find kings that had existed that they didn't think had existed. And they found that the Bible historically is accurate. And also with the Bible was written by real people who wrote down what they saw. And many of them wrote about Jesus. Some wrote about Jesus way before he was born. They were saying how he would be born. They were saying how he would die hundreds of years before he was actually born. And then people that were there at Jesus' time when he was alive on the earth wrote about what happened. So it's worth considering that Jesus wasn't a myth. Just like any historical figure, Jesus was real and existed. And there is historical proof that's incontrovertible that proves the fact that he was alive, both in Christian literature and outside of Christian literature. According to historical principles of investigation, a man called Jesus existed in the 1st century. And we know this because there are 40 records in existence that documented his existence, historical documentation, that described this man who was essentially a carpenter in the Middle East. And at the time Jesus was alive, there was a Roman emperor in place and he was called Tiberius. And we should expect that there'd be lots of documentation about Tiberius mentioning his existence. Surely he was more important than a carpenter. And there are 10 individuals that refer to the existence of Tiberius in their historical writings. That's less than that there is for Jesus. I mean, come on, Jesus is even mentioned in the Quran. So you can see we have excellent evidence that Jesus lived, was real, and he existed. Now the scholars who study Jesus' life, regardless of whether they're atheist, Buddhist, agnostic, Hindu or Christian, it doesn't matter. They all conclude that Jesus died on the cross. And from the writings that are available, every scholar can conclude that Jesus was dead on the cross, even at the point where they put the spear in his side and the blood and water that was separated came out. Even the Journal of the American Medical Association, a secular scientific journal, conducted an investigation into the death of Jesus. And they said clearly that the weight of the historical evidence and the medical evidence indicate that Jesus was dead before the wound to his side was inflicted. So we have excellent reason to believe that Jesus died on the cross. So far we've established that there's undeniable truth to Jesus' existence and there's undeniable truth and evidence to his death on the cross. So what about the resurrection? What about being raised from the dead? As a former atheist, I used to believe that it was a load of rubbish and that he wasn't raised from the dead. And I'd often heard people talk about a legend, that it was a legend that Jesus had been raised from the dead. And even I had a bit of difficulty with that because I always thought that a legend is something that developed over time. So it might take 100 to 200 years for a legend to develop and that people believe that that legend is true. So for Jesus, that would mean that 100 to 200 years after he had died, that legend would have evolved. However, that isn't what happened with Jesus. The earliest writings that we have about Jesus' death and resurrection that are still in existence today are from 50 AD, 50 years after his death. That's far too quick for it to be a legend. And nearly all scholars agree on these things about Jesus. Number one, that he died on the cross. Number two, that the disciples absolutely believed that they had seen him raised from the dead, that they had encountered him. And number three, that all the disciples, the apostles, they believed this so much that they would go to their own horrific deaths, that they would be martyred based on these encounters. Something had happened to make them die for that belief system. They were either all mad or something was true. And lots of historians, when they research the ancient world, often say that most of what we believe about the ancient world is based on one or maybe two sources, that all the information have similarities to these one or two sources. However, the conviction of these disciples at Jesus' death and then what they say was a resurrection created a whole religion to evolve that still continues today. And guess what? People today still encounter the resurrected Jesus. My own atheism was completely destroyed when I had a real encounter with the risen Jesus. So after I'd done my own research, it became impossible to maintain my atheism. The evidence of the Bible, the evidence of the early believers, and now my very own evidence, which included encounters with Jesus and starting to see miracle signs and wonders that couldn't be explained by the natural world, all became too compelling. My logic of being an atheist had gone out of the window. I realised it would take more faith to maintain being an atheist than actually becoming a Christian. The Christianity was more believable than being an atheist. And as an atheist, I'd suddenly found that it's all real. The Bible is real, Jesus is real, Jesus' death and resurrection is real. Now, if all this is real, then heaven is real. And if heaven is real, then hell is real. And be really clear, time waits for nobody. You need to start believing in Jesus before you take your last breath on this earth. And if after you die, if you end up in hell, then remember, you chose it. And you will not sit there and argue with him. You'll know what you have done. And if you're an atheist, let me tell you something, that's your dilemma. If you still think, despite all the evidence, that when you die, there is no God, that it's just an eternal consciousness, then you're gambling with your life and your soul. And that is not a gamble anyone should take. God bless you guys.